Hey guys, and welcome to another video by artincontext.org where we explore various art-related topics. My name is Matt, and in today's tutorial we will be covering the topic of how to create abstract paintings with watercolor. Now, when it comes to the subject of abstract painting, there are no rules, and this means that as we pursue an abstract artwork, our creative exploration can go in all sorts of directions, and ultimately that could be classified as an abstract work. However, something really important in terms of trying to have some sort of navigation with your abstract painting process is to consider the medium you're using. And in the case of watercolor, we have a great opportunity to explore the potential of the medium itself and what is actually possible through the watercolor painting process. With that being said, in this tutorial what we'll do is we'll look at a way to create unique and interesting shapes. We'll learn how to utilize the water-soluble nature of the medium in order to integrate colors in a seamless transition. We'll also look at layering effects and other various watercolor specific techniques that we can ultimately use in order to create something interesting and beautiful. Now, when it comes to the watercolor medium, something very unique is this quality of layering, and as we work with this quality of layering throughout our abstract painting process, we'll start to see that working in backgrounds, midgrounds and foregrounds and playing around with our mark making process as we go through our abstract painting is ultimately going to enrich the painting and keep it from seeming quite flat. So that being said, what we can start to think about is the orientation of our background, and this is where we can start playing around with shapes, start to play around with our color choice, and this is where we can start considering how various colors work well with one another. So for instance, if you want to pursue something a little bit more natural and kind of stays within these natural tones, working with brown hues in your colors or softening your colors with whites is a great way to get that more neutral or natural color palette. Now, as you proceed with this early stage of setting up a background, something you want to think about is the composition of your abstract painting. So this is where we start thinking about shape and form and how different shapes work well with one another to not only create this well-balanced ratio between the amount of shapes we paint, but in the process of doing so, we can allow ourselves to also consider the color palette that we choose. And this is where we can play around with integrating various colors. And as we allow ourselves to play around with different types of shapes, whether they be more natural or something a little bit more geometric, in the process of doing so, understanding a color palette, or at least considering what type of color palette will ultimately work well with those shape formations. So the idea is that we don't necessarily just want to think about a shape in isolation. What we want to do is we want to start thinking about a few things in tandem with one another and start to think about how these various components will serve each other. So for instance, as you play around with creating your background and you start to integrate shapes, you can already start to consider the color palette and the overall tone that you would like your artwork to be, and how that color palette serves the composition and shapes that you start to integrate into your abstract painting. Now, another thing we want to think about throughout the process of creating an abstract watercolor painting is what is the potential with the watercolor medium itself, and this is where we start to think about the water-soluble nature of the medium. So for instance, something that is really unique to the watercolor medium is that when you work on a wet surface area, you can start to create these seamless integrations or transitions between colors. So throughout your entire painting process, as you proceed to make shapes, what you can start to do is consider working quite quickly whilst the surface area of your shape is wet, and then play around with integrating colors into your shapes. The idea is that once you have a wet surface area and you start to integrate various colors, as that surface area dries, all those colors will seamlessly integrate into one another as they all dry collectively at one time. Now, this is a concept that works really well, especially within the abstract painting process, because you can really play around with creating these beautiful transitions between colors. So working with this specific technique within the watercolor medium is a really great way to not only create something really interesting, but something very painterly and very specific to the watercolor medium itself. Now, as we proceed with our painting process, on the other side, another thing to consider is how to create these layering effects once the paint is dry on the page. So we've spoken about how to work in various colors and how to create transitions between colors whilst the surface area is still wet. But on the other hand, we can create these really beautiful layering qualities when the surface area is completely dry. And what we'll find is, as we continue to paint new patterns on top of dried patterns or patterns we've painted before and that we have allowed to completely dry, the effect of this painting process will result in these patterns having this translucent layering effect and ultimately creating another very specific and unique aesthetic to the watercolor medium itself. So again, thinking through the capacity and the potential of the watercolor medium is really important when you're considering making a watercolor painting. And this is where we can use this wet on wet process, like we have described before, where we integrate colors and shapes and merge them into one another whilst the surface area is still wet. But on the other hand, when we create patterns and marks with our painting process and do so when the surface area is dry, we can create this very unique layering effect where we start to see shapes layered on top of one another and creating this translucent overlapping quality, which has this beautiful effect and is just another technique to play around when considering creating a watercolor abstract painting. So again, allow yourself to play around with this idea of creating layers, and this is where you want to create a background and establish some base layers. Start to think about composition and orientation, start to think about color palettes and how they serve not only the composition but also the shapes themselves, and ultimately work with these different watercolor painting processes. So we can work with this wet on wet process where we work with the wet surface and integrate colors and marks into a wet surface, ultimately allowing more seamless transitions and integrations between colors and marks. And then we can also create these marks once the surface area is dry, where we layer new marks on top of that dry surface in order to create a layering quality or this translucent overlapping quality between shapes. Now again, there are no rules, so really allow yourself to play around, really allow yourself to think about the color palette and the variety of shapes you want to integrate into your abstract painting, and explore variation. I mean, you can also integrate this combination of geometric and natural shapes. You can also play around with coloring your entire page or working with negative space. So it's really up to you in terms of how you want your overall composition to look in terms of color and shape. With that being said, what we're gonna look at is how to utilize other tools, and this is where masking tape becomes a really valuable tool in the painting medium, especially in the watercolor medium. So in terms of working with these layering effects, you can use masking tape to create this quality of geometric shapes and how they interact or kind of overlap these more neutral or natural shapes. And this is where we start to play around with this juxtaposition within our abstract painting, where we can start to see how the combination of natural and geometric shapes can be used quite strategically to create something beautiful, something unique. And this is a really fun way to play around with integrating painterly marks within your abstract painting. So working with some masking tape, allow yourself to play around with creating these shapes within your abstract painting. And this is where you can bring line work in, where you can bring squares and again, just more geometric styled patterns within your abstract painting. Now, when it comes to working with something like masking tape, again, this is a procedure where you want to make sure that the painterly marks you've done prior are completely dry. You don't want to start putting masking tape on your abstract painting and then accidentally lifting your masking tape to then pull the paint off the page. And this is a common mistake, so you want to make sure that your paint is completely dry when you play around with adding masking tape. You also don't necessarily want to stick your masking tape down too hard, again, because this could lift off some of the upper layers of the paper and then obviously cause a damaging mark on your paper itself. Now, when it comes to masking tape, what we want to bear in mind is the fact that masking tape does have this straight line or the straight edging. So we want to think about more geometric style shapes that we could integrate into whatever we have painted already. Again, we do want to make sure that the surface area of the paper is completely dry before we start taping some masking tape on the paper, and that way we are less likely to lift off any paint marks that we've already made. But we also don't necessarily want to paste the masking tape on the page too hard. We can just stick it down gently. But this is where you can start playing around with that layering effect, but this time working in some more geometric style shapes. This is just another fun way to create a unique combination of marks by the use of masking tape as a stencil. So basically we use the masking tape as a stencil, and this way we can kind of demarcate areas on the page in very unique shapes, and then paint in that masking tape stencil, and ultimately not worrying too much about trying to capture these perfect freehand lines, but rather we can use the masking tape as a stencil to make that process much easier for ourselves. We can also play around with ripping up the masking tape and create very unique styled stencils, so you don't necessarily need to use the masking tape only to create these very straight lined geometric shapes, but you can rip up masking tape and create a unique combination of marks and stencil styles, and play around with how you integrate that into your abstract painting. Again, there are no rules to abstract painting, so really try to stretch out these various tools and techniques and mediums and see how you can use them and integrate them into your abstract watercolor painting process. Now, play around with the masking tape. Allow yourself to use masking tape in all sorts of ways to create unique combinations of shapes and colors. Again, consider using the masking tape when the surface is dry. You don't want to stick masking tape on the paper when the surface of the paper is wet with paint, so that way you don't lift off any paint in a way that you don't want by accident. Now, the next thing we'll look at is something a little bit more traditional, and this is where we start integrating more familiarized imagery and shapes through the process of a more drawing style format when it comes to painting. And this is where we can again start considering the entire abstract painting and how we kind of want it to work in tandem with these other marks. So for instance, we looked at wet on wet, we looked at how to paint dry or wet marks on dry marks, and that way we can create layering. We can kind of consider how to utilize other mediums or tools such as masking tape to create unique stencils, and that way we can integrate different types of shapes into our abstract painting. But now what we'll look at is how to kind of create or use more traditional and more drawing style painterly marks to create something or integrate something unique into our abstract painting. And this is where you can start thinking about how the painting kind of looks already. So naturally, as you go through an abstract painting process, you slowly find that as you build up layers and add marks, you want to start noticing what the painting looks like at a point, and then start to think about, well, what next set of marks or next set of shapes could be used to not only work with this painting in its current state, but how to enhance it further. So you can start thinking about natural elements, or again more structural and mechanical style elements, more geometric styles, but it depends on how these new marks might serve or enhance the painting in its current state. So for instance, when you consider what you have painted already, whether it's more naturalistic shapes or as a combination of geometric style shapes and natural shapes, you're thinking again about the color palette. You can start to think about what type of more drawing style or painterly marks can I layer on top of this in order to serve the painting or kind of increase and enhance the overall aesthetic of the abstract painting. Now, in the case of this painting, looking at more natural elements or being inspired by more natural elements like branches and leaves and vines can be a really good source of inspiration that serves and works quite well to complement the already natural tones and natural styled shapes that have been painted prior. So again, this isn't also something that you need to do in terms of creating more identifiable structures like leaves and branches or any other identifiable structure, but you can also start to think about shapes and patterns and how they ultimately serve the overall painting. So again, really allow yourself to kind of go in whatever direction you please when it comes to creating an abstract painting, because in some sense we can, as we have done throughout this tutorial, we can create more identifiable shapes, we can create these larger structures. We're considering how these shapes kind of work in tandem with one another to set the background or the backdrop of what we can then later paint within our abstract painting. But this is where we can also start to think about patterns or smaller patterns that kind of work over these larger structures, such as polka dots and lines. But again, you can play around with these more recognizable features like branches and leaves, but it really is up to you. You can also start to integrate these more patternly like marks, and this is where that layering effect really starts to play a vital role. So once your painting has dried, you can start creating these more distinct and darker marks on top that start to bring a nice juxtaposition and contrast between these layers on top and the layers that you have painted below. So allow yourself to play around with this and try to see how your background can be enhanced by maybe darker and more drawing style marks that work well on top as another layer. And this is also a great way to create that quality of depth, that way your painting doesn't necessarily fall flat. Throughout your painting process, it's also really important to consider tonal range, and this is where we want to consider even from the early stages of our abstract painting, how lighter marks and lighter shapes can be used to establish these backdrops and backgrounds or these earlier layers, which on top of as we go through our painting process, we can create darker marks on top of these lighter layers or these earlier lighter layers. So when you're thinking about doing an abstract painting or kind of just doing any painting that requires layering, especially in the watercolor medium, it's always good to consider the tonal range in terms of what would be lost throughout the painting process and how to retain a variety of different tonal values. So for instance, within your abstract painting, it's really important to consider how lighter tones and lighter values work well within the earlier stages, because this way, as you proceed with your painting process, you can start to integrate darker marks on top, and this does two things. For one, it creates a quality of depth and allows the painting to not necessarily fall flat by creating this quality of darker marks layered on top of lighter marks. But then the other thing it does is it allows you to retain these lighter qualities from the earlier stages, and that way you don't necessarily just have a dark painting, but you do have a painting that has a variety of values that not necessarily only create depth, but you can see them from the earlier layers all the way to the later layers. So when it comes to creating an abstract painting with watercolor, this layering effect is really important in terms of maintaining a tonal variation, but also then to create a quality of depth within your painting that allows the painting to seem a little bit more interesting and therefore not fall flat. So again, as we play around with these latter painterly marks and we can start to incorporate these darker features, we can start to play around with pattern styles that kind of work on top of these lighter layers, and this is where we can work in these darker painterly marks. And this is where again you can play around with line work, maybe with dots, with different types of patterns overlapping other patterns, maybe identifiable features. But up until this point, it's really up to you. Another thing to note when it comes to abstract painting is, again, to think about the entire composition as a whole, from the early stages all the way to the later stages. And this is where we want to think about not necessarily painting too much. It really is up to you, but knowing when to stop when doing an abstract painting is a really overlook skill. And I think this is because when you are in the heat of the moment, or if you're busy with the painting process, you can just get carried away with this layering quality and adding marks and so on and so on. But knowing when to stop, knowing when to step away and maintain the balance that you have achieved throughout your painting process is a really profound skill, and it's also going to serve the painting well. So thinking about ratio, thinking about composition, and thinking about balance throughout the entire painting process is really important. It should also be something you maintain throughout the painting process, with the idea of caution as you apply marks. So what I mean by this is that you don't necessarily need to just go ahead and impulsively paint marks. What you want to do is you want to think ahead and kind of just plan out what kind of shape you're trying to achieve before you make a mark, and you want to do so as you build up layers until you come to the completion of your abstract painting. So yeah, allow yourself to play around with these latter, more drawing style painterly marks, where you start to layer these darker shapes on top of these more beautiful and softer tones you've established in the earlier stages of this painting process. And this way you can again create this idea and this feeling of depth within your painting, but that way you can also maintain a variety of color values that aren't necessarily just dark, but kind of fall within the spectrum between lighter and darker tonal ranges. Otherwise, guys, this is the general process of how to create an abstract painting. There are some concepts and ideas we've explored here, some of them very unique to the watercolor medium, whether it is creating seamless transitions between colors through the process of wet on wet paint, or the concept of creating more translucent and transparent layering qualities between shapes, where we paint over already dried surface areas. We've talked about how to utilize masking tape as a tool to create very specific shapes and patterns that could be strategically integrated into your painting process. Thinking about natural tones, thinking about more vivid tones, thinking about composition and shape and ratio, and how to maintain balance throughout your abstract painting. And then lastly, how to create this quality of depth by painting darker marks in the later stages that ultimately work well over these lighter marks from the earlier stages. But otherwise, guys, that is it from my side. I hope there are some key concepts and principles you've learned throughout this painting process. Again, abstract painting is really a subjective experience, and it's really up to you, but this tutorial does give you some insight in terms of how to use the watercolor medium strategically, and trying to give you a sense of direction and guide you in your abstract painting approach. If this tutorial was helpful, please give it a like and a subscribe. This helps to grow the channel and ultimately enables us to make more art related content for you. If you are interested in similar topics, please let us know in the comment section below. Otherwise, guys, thanks again. That's it from me. Until next time, cheers.